My wife and I recently found out we're expecting a little boy, and I figured if he's going to get stuck with the smallest room, we could at least make it cool. Let's get into it. I wasn't originally planning on having this included in the video, but I figured it's always nice to see what we started with and where we ended up. There was wood paneling nailed on top of rock glass board and tiles glued on the ceiling. This was the only room in the house like this, and it kinda drove me nuts. As you can see, I've already demoed the walls down to the studs, and then I started working on the ceiling. I wish I knew what kind of glue they used on these tiles, because going back through and scraping off all the globs was no easy task. I'm also really glad we use screws now for drywall after always having to go through and remove a million of these nails from the old plasterboard. When I removed the old wood paneling, I actually saved it and ripped it down into strips to staple back onto the studs. So then after I added my new drywall, the jambs for the doors and window would be perfectly flush like they were before. Now for the big transformation with new drywall. I got 14-foot long sheets for the long walls and ceiling, so I wouldn't have any butt joints to mud at all. The long sheets were a bit of a workout working alone, but I got it done nonetheless. I'm not a professional drywall finisher, so I'm not even going to begin to pretend and give tips. The guys and girls that do this for a living are straight up artists. I actually do look forward to drywall projects in my own home though, so I can continue working on my skills, and I gotta say, this room did turn out pretty mint. With the drywall done, I could get it all primed. Then off camera I painted the ceiling, and we just went with white for the other three walls as well. Now we can actually start working on this accent wall. First I went ahead and painted the entire bare wall with our green color, which is called hemlock. For this entire wall I'm using one sheet of 1/2 inch MDF, which cost right around $25, and I actually had quite a bit left over as well. There's a few reasons I went this route that I'll go over, but the first is definitely cost, as wood prices are legit insane right now. After breaking down the sheet into a more manageable size, I then started ripping all the pieces to final width on the table saw. These first pieces are wider to act as the baseboards along the bottom, so my regular trim along the sidewall can butt right into it. For the actual design I went with two different sizes, 3¼ inch wide and then 2 inches wide, which brings me to my second reason for just using this sheet of MDF. Being that I wanted dimensions that don't come standard in the store for regular 1x material. It's also worth mentioning you can do this whole project with just a circular saw. You could even have the store rip down all these strips for you when you buy it if you wanted. The MDF comes pretty smooth, but after ripping down the strips I went ahead and quickly sanded everything with 220 grit. Since my wall is wider than 8 foot long, I had to join together two pieces for the bottom baseboard. To do this, I just used glue and pocket screws on the backside, which worked out great. While that glue dries, I went ahead and started cutting all my other pieces to final length, either with square cuts or just simple 45-degree angles. I already knew what length everything needed to be because admittedly maybe a little overkill for a chaotic pattern like this, but I drew it all up in the free version of SketchUp first, mainly to solidify a design that we liked, but then this way I could make sure everything was evenly spaced and I instantly had all my measurements. If there's a downside to using MDF, it's this right here. The edges are super thirsty and really soak up the primer, so it takes a few coats to get them perfectly smooth. But with a fast drying product, it's not a big deal. I could just keep circling through and get them knocked out in no time. I also went through after priming and laid on a good coat of green on all the edges. Now I could start adding all the pieces to the wall, starting with the bottom piece. To attach everything, I'm using an 18 gauge brad nailer with 2-inch nails to really pull the pieces tight to the studs. These first few pieces, I basically just lined them up to where both ends were flush and got them nailed on. You can see I also pre-painted all the ends that hit the outside wall or ceiling, so I wouldn't have to go through afterwards with a brush and tediously cut in again, and this ended up working awesome. Once those starting pieces were on, I cut some scraps of the MDF down to size to act as spacers, so the next pieces would be perfectly parallel and all the spaces even. You can see I'm not using glue or anything on the back of the boards. I just designed it to where each piece would cross multiple studs, and just using the nails alone would give me a great connection. And where any of the pieces joined not on a stud, I also toe-nailed the pieces together. It kind of looks like there's big gaps here in a few spots, but that's just some of the green paint from the edges. You can see how good the 1/2 inch MDF really sucks to the wall when you nail it, and I didn't even have to go through and caulk the edges at all. So really there's very minimal damage done to the wall for when this fad dies and someone wants to remove this in the future, unlike those ceiling tiles at the beginning. With all the pieces on, I quickly went over the nail holes and seams with 220 grit and then got them all filled with Bondo to make sure they're nice and smooth. I touched up the bondoed spots with primer and then I could roll on the final coats of green. Pre-painting the wall and all the edges of the boards was a huge time saver. No brush work at all here at the end, just a mini roller to coat the face of the boards. Before my daughter was born, I made her a similar sign. I didn't have a CNC at the time, so another great option is using a scroll saw. You can simply print out whatever you want to cut, use some spray adhesive to glue it to your material, and then follow that on the saw. Personally, I find it a very fun tool to use, and you can buy these for pretty cheap. With that being said, I've been loving having the Imagination to Reality I2R8 CNC machine in the shop, and after a quick programming and V-carve, the machine was off to cutting with a Freud 1/4 inch spiral bit. I tried to leave off the dust collection so you guys could see it cutting on video, but that's definitely a bad idea with MDF. I also used the I2R8 to cut out my circle from some white oak plywood. That Freud downcut spiral bit sure does leave some crispy edges in plywood. Next, I brought out my lifetime supply of white oak edge banding to get that plywood edge covered up. I plan on building the furniture for this room out of white oak, and I wanted to test out some Rubio Monocoat Natural here. And we're definitely loving the color, so I think that's what we're going to go ahead with on all the furniture. After priming the name, I sprayed on a couple coats of white, and for the green letters, I just used a tiny brush with the same green from the wall. Lastly, I used some Starbond CA glue and activator to get the letters attached to the plywood. After getting the sign hung up, that's a wrap for this video. I still need to do the rest of the trim work in the room, but that'll be for my next video where I do my entire house and I show several tips and tricks along the way. So make sure you subscribe if you're not already.